I wasn't gonna do one of these because I didn't think it was all that important, but after realizing the potential consequences of not expressing my scale, I decided it warranted a video because there are many scales that seem identical, but in actuality are not identical. So, two people can give a film the same numerical value and mean completely different things. And for that reason, I think it's important to clarify my interpretation. From what I've noticed in my limited consumption of movie reviews, there are 5 widely used scales. The first is ranking a film with letters. Think Chris Stuckman, the top score being an A+, the bottom score being an F. Then we have 2 star-based scales, 4-star and 5-star, and 4-star is typically used in more traditional publications. 5-star is also used traditionally, but it's also widely used on the internet. The last scale I'm really counting as 2 scales because I'm going to be talking about 2 different interpretations of the scale of 1 to 10. There's obviously ambiguity in interpretation for all the other scales I mentioned, and every scale, really, but the 2 I'm talking about come from completely different frames of mind. One scale, which is used by YMS, for example, sees an average film as a 5, and if it goes above the Call of Duty, he adds more points to it, and if it's below average, obviously he takes away points, and this makes numerical sense. However, this is not the scale I use. When I rate films on a scale of 1 to 10, I essentially use the numbers as test scores. So, a 7 would be equivalent to a 70% on a test, a C, which is an average score, and so it's an average movie, or an average good movie. A 7 is the lowest score I'd consider a good movie. So, if I rate a film a 7, that means I liked it. An example of a 7 would be the 2013 film Rush. I think the film realizes Niki Lauda as a character very well, and takes what could be a heavily cliched story and makes it feel less manipulative than I expected from it. That said, it doesn't do a whole lot for me emotionally, and I feel that at times it lacks a certain energy that this type of film needs, but it's solid, and for that I give it a 7. A 6 isn't necessarily a bad score, but it's a 60%, which is the lowest passing score, and so if I give a film a 6, that doesn't necessarily mean that I liked it, but I still consider it a passable film. A great example of a perfect 6 for me, 60% on the dot, is The Fundamentals of Caring with Paul Rudd and Craig Roberts. It's one of the most by-the-books movies I think I've ever seen. Predictable, cliched, it checks off just about every road trip movie trope I can think of, but because of the chemistry between Paul Rudd and Craig Roberts and a semi-fresh take on Roberts' character archetype, I gave it a pass. Again, I wouldn't call it a good movie, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty inoffensive, artistically speaking. Just cliched, which I think is perfect for 60%, the bare minimum. I think the difference between the scales is that the YMS scale sees a default film existing from the beginning, and from there it can only move up or down from the middle, whereas the scale I use sees a film starting at 0 and is constantly adding points. The aspects that the former scale sees as taking away points from the score, the latter scale sees as simply adding nothing to the score, like an incorrect question on a test. Because of this, it's incredibly difficult for me to give a movie a 1. I will give a movie points for having a coherent story, for having semi-defined characters and that they have a name and a reason for existing, for having competently composed cinematography, listenable sound. These bare bones requirements, which the other scale sees as expected or as given, on my scale are the equivalent of the first few questions on a math test, where it's just the most basic example of whatever concept you're being tested on, often an example ripped straight out of the textbook you studied. Getting them right isn't anything impressive, but it still adds points to the score. You have to really try to get a 10% on a test. A movie I'd consider a 1 would be Birdemic, just complete incompetence. A 2 would be The Room, which, as terrible as it is far more competent than Birdemic. A 3 would be The Babysitter, which has a competent story, competent cinematography, even some semblance of artistic direction and homage, even though it's bad homage. A 4 would be something like The Cloverfield Paradox, which may not be a technical masterpiece, but has at least pretty solid production value. But the characters and story are just an absolute mess, and while they were able to put together some sort of Frankenstein story in the end, all patched together, it's clearly very muddled and bad. A 5 would be M. Night Shyamalan's The Visit, which is almost passable. A lot of people liked it a lot just because of how great it looked compared to his prior decade of work, and it does have some genuine heart to it. The performances are believable and occasionally funny, but so much of the movie consists of the grandparents doing stuff that's supposed to be scary, and it just looks ridiculous and silly and stupid. And the internal arc they tried to give the main character halfway through the film isn't exactly executed as well as it probably should have. I wouldn't consider it terrible, but it's certainly not enjoyable, and there's too much bad stuff for me to consider it passable, so I give it a 5. Does that mean a 10 for me is a perfect film? After all, a 100% is a perfect score. But no, a 10 is not a perfect film, because a perfect film does not exist. A 10 would be something as close to perfect as possible, something like 2001, something that pushes my intellectual boundaries, or something that, even if it's somewhat flawed, makes me feel something unique and powerful to the point where I'm able to forgive those flaws. Take Submarine, for instance. That movie is not a 10. At times it feels like a Wes Anderson ripoff, and it has a few minor pacing issues. When I first saw it, I gave it an 8, which is an incredibly more fair rating. But as years have gone by, and I've rewatched it over and over, I've resonated emotionally with it more and more. I see myself in this character, Oliver Tate, like no other character. Maybe he's a cliche, but that makes me a cliche, because some of the hypotheticals he runs through his head in his inner monologue or whatever are things that had been going through my head for years before I even saw the movie. Like when he imagines dying and everyone mourning him, and then him coming back to life and being universally loved. I had been having that fantasy since like the 5th grade. His self-awareness, I think, is very clever at times, and his cringiness and selfishness are things that I relate to. But it's not just his character that I've grown to appreciate. It's stuff like the design of his room, or the soundtrack, or the one-liners. And I've grown to love it at a cult classic level, where my love for it ignores the fact that it's far from perfect. And for that, I give it a 10 anyway. Kubrick pumped out 10s left and right. Paul Thomas Anderson is pumping out 10s left and right. I'm a bit of a 10 whore, if I'm being honest, but I love movies, and I can't help myself. A 9 would be something that's so close to a 10, but has a couple things holding it back so it doesn't completely do it for me. An example of this would be The Empire Strikes Back. It's the most emotionally resonant Star Wars movie, for me at least. It's gorgeously put together, but occasionally we get something that takes us out of the movie, like the giant space worm Han and Leia encounter. And their relationship, I think, could have used a little more development before reaching the climax it does. And, of course, an 8 is somewhere between a 7 and a 9. It's certainly above average, but not quite close to a 10. A very enjoyable, well-made, albeit somewhat flawed film. I see something like Sicario as an 8. Great tension and build-up, great philosophical debate in the movie, but suffers from some pacing issues and peaks a little early. I know my last video had a lot of seemingly hot takes about objectivity and subjectivity, and I think a lot of what I was trying to say was lost in translation, because I believe, like everyone should believe, that watching a movie or consuming any form of art is ultimately a subjective experience. And while I love movies that fire on all cylinders in the technical departments, I can still give something as revolutionary as 2001 the same score as an unimportant little indie film like Submarine, because as incomparable as they are, they both individually do just about everything for me that I could ask of them. And yes, this scale may not make as much numerical sense as the 5 average scale, but the connotations these numbers hold are very powerful. To call something that I consider a decent, average film a 5 feels like I'm selling the film a little short. I've been conditioned by grades to feel these connotations for these numbers, and while mathematically the other scale may be a better numerical representation, I believe that the point of a numerical scale in general is to most precisely pinpoint how one feels about a film, and for that reason, I think it makes sense to label a film with a number I feel the same way about. It's like the metric and imperial systems. Sure, the metric system makes more mathematical sense, but I've been using the imperial system my whole life, and that's what I've gained my bearings on. So, as long as we're able to communicate which scale we're using, we should be able to keep ambiguity and confusion down to a minimum, because no one should have to change what scale they're using. All scales are valid as long as you remain consistent with the scale you're using. Hopefully that better contextualizes my reviews, makes my ratings make a little more sense to any of you who are confused. Let me know what scale you use, what makes the most sense to you, and I'll see you next week.